So this is chapter 13. We are continuing with video number 2. The chapter is titled The Institution of Political Institutions and the Economy. So societies typically have a nation state. What is a nation state? It is the political institution or unit of political power over a large geographical area. So usually there's several independent political units within this nation state, but it serves as one unit held together that has ultimate authority over a territory. Okay, so these nation states or states, or a nation, okay, we have smaller states within, but there's a nation overall of the United States. This occurrence of this is actually relatively new when we're thinking, comparatively speaking, of our Earth's history. Most of human history, like 99% of our human history, people lived in hunter-gatherer societies, small groups, and they didn't need a large legal system. This wasn't needed because there wasn't a whole lot of conflict inside these small hunter-gatherer groups, and they didn't need these large systems to oversee. So remember, this is relatively new. So what holds nation states together? Well, it is this system of nationalism. It's people's commitment to a common destiny based on a common past and a shared future vision. We know that our shared history is very important to us because we teach it to children from a very early age when they're in the school system. They're always learning about our shared nation's history. So that is a sense of nationalism. It holds us together, we're integrated, and it produces unity. So then within a nation state usually has a government or that physical political structure that rules over the nation. So our nation state, okay, is made up of smaller political units, but the nation state is one overall. And then they have a system of government within that nation state, which rules the nation, produces rules, laws, in ways that the nation state behaves. So we're not going to talk a lot in this chapter about the 3 sociological perspectives, but we're going to take a minute to talk a little bit about functionalism and conflict theory and their perspective on nation states. So remember, functionalism is the perspective that looks at society as a system of interrelated parts. And if one part of society changes or has a disruption, it causes changes in all the other parts. So functionalism looks at stating that nation states form, they arise or they occur because society needs them. A government is needed and boundaries are needed to mobilize resources, to plan, to coordinate, to achieve commonly shared goals. And that power within the government helps to settle internal conflicts from being disruptive. So functionalists would look at this COVID-19 situation that we're currently in, and it would say, we need this nation state to be able to coordinate our resources, to decide where supplies, ventilators, how about funds and money are going to be able to settle this situation and achieve commonly shared goals of having a healthy country. Conflict theory sees that nation states serve the will of elites through power, force, ownership over businesses, that government and its institutions make decisions to benefit the ruling class. We're going to get more into this perspective and this way of looking at nation states later on in this chapter, but we're bringing up the term of false consciousness again, where people basically are self-serving to support ruling elite. So we're going to move into talking a little bit about political systems and the different types. So we're going to cover democracies, totalitarianism, and authoritarianism. So as we go through these, please remember that when we're talking about different political systems, different economies, these are ideal types, which means these are perfect. So in a perfect world, this is what they would look like. But we do not live in a perfect world. Um, Let me show you a little graphic here. On page 377 in your book, it talks about a political continuum. And it says political institutions offer varying degrees of freedom for their members. So the different political systems offer, again, what it just says, it offers different degrees or levels of freedom. So you can pure democracy is on the left-hand side, and totalitarianism is on the right side. And it also gives examples falls in these different types of groups. Let's first describe these types of groups. Okay, so a democracy is a form of self-government that involves the participation of all citizens. So an ideal type means, and an example of this would be a New England town. So when our country was first formed, those first colonies, those little New England towns, when they wanted to make a decision about something, they would get everybody together, which technically it wasn't everybody because women weren't allowed to vote at that time, but all the men would get together and they would make decisions, they would vote as a group on how things would work. Okay, so that is an ideal type. Newsflash, we do not live in a democracy here in the United States. We belong to something called a representative democracy. So it's a system of electing officials responsible for fulfilling the wishes of the majority. So we elect legislators to go to Springfield, to go to Washington, D.C., and do a lot of this political work for us. Okay? We don't have time to take off of work every time they need to vote on something new. When they're trying to make budgets for our state, we don't have time, all of us, to go to Springfield and come together and vote on it as a group. No. We elect officials to go and do that work for us. So what's supposed to happen is that our legislators, our local people that you hear about, Durbin, Charlie Meyer, all of them, their job, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to take the wishes of the people in their districts and go and do the work for us. They're supposed to be our representatives. Okay, that's where that word comes from. So then the next level is something called, I'm going to skip forward just a minute. Let's talk about authoritarianism, which is the next step over. It's a political system controlled by non-elected rulers who permit some degree of individual freedom. So some examples of these would be monarchies, dictatorships. If you've ever heard about military seizures of power, they're not elected people. They're appointed, or they just take over a society or a nation state, but they do permit some degree of individual freedom. So our book says that Cuba, when it was ruled by Fidel Castro, was an example of authoritarianism society. And the last one, which is the most extreme, is a totalitarianism. So you can think of it as total control. That total word is in the term itself. It's when a ruler with absolute power attempts to control all aspects of social life, and it's usually a single political party controlled by one person. And the best example that we have is Hitler in Nazi Germany. So we've talked about what nation states are, what types of political systems or ruling that we have here on our globe. Now we're going to look a little bit about a different kind of force, a different kind of power, power through terrorism. So think about terrorism. What does terrorism mean to you? What comes to mind when you think about terrorism? Those of us who are relatively young, I know when that word terrorism first comes to mind in my brain is 9/11 and what happened on that day. Okay. Um, so I'm going to read a little bit to you from the book on page uh, 378. So it's just a page after. I'm going to show it to you here in your book. I've got it highlighted here kind of in the middle on the right side of the page. It says, to most Americans, terrorism is a new phenomenon. Sure, Americans were aware of terrorist attacks occurring over there or in a different country, but such attacks were impersonal and abstract, the way war can be if you or your country is not engaged. Terrorism suddenly became personal on the morning of September 11th, 2001. So most people always thought of terrorism as being, oh, that's something over there. That's something that happens in those foreign countries. It became real to us when it was on our soil. So terrorism is not a new thing. So the definition of terrorism in our book is that terrorism is the illegal use of violence or threats of violence against a government, a group, or an individual. And usually they're in pursuit of a political, a religious, an economic, or some sort of social goal. So that is really broadening our idea of what terrorism is. I want to expand your memory. So this is what us as Americans typically think about what terrorism is. But these are some older examples of things that qualify as terrorism. So these are two pictures. One is of the Crusades back in the Middle Ages. Think about the Crusades when they were the fighting that went on between Protestants and Catholics. They were fighting in pursuit of religious goals, and they used violence, threats of violence against groups of people, individuals, and groups. Think about the Ku Klux Klan and our current white supremacist groups. They use violence. I mean, they killed people, they hung people. They're still committing acts of hate crimes against groups for social and economic and sometimes religious goals. So there's different types of terrorism. So we're breaking it down even further. There's revolutionary terrorism, acts of violence aimed at replacing an existing government. That happens a lot. We hear about it now in like the Middle East. There's totalitarian. It's acts done by an established and legitimate government using violence and fear to intimidate. So think about Nazi Germany. Remember that total word meaning total control. There's state terrorism, where manipulation occurs through normal government agencies rather than through coercive forces, and it targets only specific groups. Our own country could be categorized as doing this. Think about Japanese internment camps during World War II. Think about some of the government coups that our country has been involved in. And the last is international terrorism. This is what we think of when we think of 9/11 and those acts committed during that time. It's when a foreign country acts abroad, collaborating with terrorist groups in another country. So we are going to take another quick break and then move into economic systems.